Thank you all so much for being here. It means everything to me that we can all get together in 3 dimensions after years of doing these talks over Zoom. It's so wonderful to see that we can have an exchange as a community. And I say that knowing that everybody in this room has myriad obligations in life and demands on them. You have kids, you have elders, you have significant others, you have spouses, and I'm just very grateful that you would spend time to come out and gather together tonight in this beautiful and magnificent setting. It's always very meaningful to me to speak in Freemasonic spaces. I've spoken in many different lodge rooms, and a lot of people don't know this, but I'm sure there are certain people seated in this room who are aware of this. These lodge rooms, in addition to the various and extraordinary esoteric imagery that populates the room, including the mysterious Masonic letter G, Gnosticism, God, geometry, all 3 and more. These rooms are laid out and designed, strangely as it may sound, as the sanctuary of an Orthodox synagogue. When I was a kid, I was bar mitzvahed at an Orthodox synagogue. I was dressed a little differently, but the manner in which an Orthodox synagogue is laid out is that the Torah scrolls will be up on an altar, very much like this one, with a light eternally burning above them. And when the Torah scrolls are removed, one of the 5 scrolls is brought to the center of the room where there is traditionally an altar. There is an altar at times in this center space, but there's not one there right now. And people will read from the Torah at the center of the room rather than up on an altar. And traditionally, men and women are seated in different sections. So very frequently you may find the men all seated on one side, the women all seated on another side. But beyond certain details, that's very much what it looks like. We're gathered tonight for a historical anniversary that is a tragic anniversary, and that is the absolute destruction and decimation of the Knights Templar on a Friday the 13th, like tonight, in the year 1307. It was a Friday the 13th in the month of October. The Crusades several years earlier had wound down. There had been so many losses on both sides, Christian and Muslim, that the fighting after generations and generations just ground to a close. And the Knights Templar, which was a fighting force in the Crusades, may have been the one organization that emerged more powerful than it had been before. By that point in history, the French aristocracy was in debt to the Templars. They were not only a martial and a fighting order, but also a banking and financial order. The papacy, which was undergoing its own civil strife in Italy and which was in the process of relocating to Avignon, France, was also in debt to the Templars. And the Templars, as a fighting force, was quite robust and combat ready. So naturally, people in power who were in debt, who were trying to rebuild their own forces after generations of largely fruitless warfare, were fearful of the Templars. And the leader of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was summoned by Pope Clement to the Pope's palace in Avignon. And if any of you have visited the Pope's palace in Avignon, you know it resembles nothing so much as an enormous military fortress. And de Molay, we're not quite sure, but it was either 1306 or 1307, was summoned to Avignon under the false pretext of discussing a new crusade. The idea being, this was so great before, let's just do it again. So he was lied to, and he was drawn to the Pope's palace. And he was, on the morning of Friday the 13th, October 13th, arrested and charged with a wide variety of heresies against the church. There were rumors and stories that during the course of the Crusades, the Templars had reverted to a kind of paganism, and that the Templars were, by varying accounts, worshiping a disembodied head, or by other accounts, worshiping a goat's head. And this goat's head was sometimes referred to as a Baphomet, which was probably a mangling of the old French word for Muhammad, the prophet of the opposing side. The old French word was Muhammad, and it probably got mangled into Baphomet, which many of us know from Eliphas Levi's famous drawing of the goat-headed androgynous figure with its arms stretched in opposing directions, also inspiration for the magician card in the tarot deck. Now, another variation on this was that the Knights Templar were worshiping a goat's head, and that might have harkened back to the ancient Egyptian ram god called Menejabet. And Menejabet was housed in the city of Mendes, a ceremonial city. And the ancient Egyptians, not infrequently in sort of maudlin horror movies, you'll see people celebrating black masses and killing goats. The ancient Egyptians did not kill goats. They loved and venerated goats. The idea of an ancient Egyptian worshiper at the city of Mendes killing a goat would have been considered the ultimate outrage. And there were other stories, such as the knights engaging in homosexuality and so forth. And really, we don't know whether there's any truth to any of this, because all of this information was garnered under forced interrogations. The Knights Templar throughout France were arrested. By 1310, 54 Knights Templar had been burned at the stake, a horrific sentence. And the church kept Jacques de Molay alive because he served a propaganda purpose. They kept trying to get out of him forced interrogations about the terrible things that the Knights Templar had been doing in order that the church and the aristocracy could justify its mass slaughter. And de Molay made certain confessions under torture, and then later he withdrew his confessions. But eventually, by 1312, he too was burned at the stake, and the Templars were officially dissolved as a ecclesiastical and military order. And there were rumors and stories, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that some Templars escaped. There's a storyline that you'll find in various popular literature that they migrated to Scotland and they assisted the Scottish freedom fighter nationalist Robert the Bruce in a war against Britain, and then with the building of the Roslin Chapel in Scotland, some historians claim that you see Templar symbols spread throughout the chapel. I'm doubtful of those stories only because we really just don't have any evidence. And with the passage of centuries, there are certain symbols and signs that more or less start to enter into the bloodstream of decorative or religious design. And we have a very thin gauze of evidence that there was any survival of the Templars. And I think in general, the retention of religious or spiritual ideas when there's a absolutely bloody crackdown on a certain group. You can think of people who were accused of practicing witchcraft in the Middle Ages, and the tens of thousands of people, most of them innocent, although I don't think you should have to claim innocence for the practice of any form of spirituality or conjuring or occult practice. But the tens of thousands of people who were killed make it very difficult for there to be retentive practices, signs, symbols, especially when no mass media existed and anything that was passed along would have to be written down by hand and so on. So it's doubtful to me that the Templars left a legacy, and yet we do see legacies emanating out in a ripple from the tragic events of that time. And I think that one of the legacies that we see, and humanity seems to repeat this over and over, both on small scales and on massive scales, is ruling institutions projecting their own crimes or misgivings or hypocrisies onto groups that either are considered marginal or threatening or somehow can be subjugated. There seems to be this process of projection that repeats itself over and over, so that whatever a marginalized or feared or vulnerable group, I wouldn't exactly call the Knights vulnerable, but they certainly proved to be when they were faced with the overwhelming power judicially and militarily of the French aristocracy and the Vatican. Over and over, there is projected onto groups that are somewhat off to the margins of society these imagined traits that are dramatized and rendered in hyperbolic tones, and then there's this punishment directed against these groups. And of course, this has been part of the story of Freemasonry as well. If you spend any time at all online or on any of the social media platforms, which obviously we all do, you know that reference to Masonry or the Illuminati or the Knights Templar or sometimes even the Rosicrucians, which I'll be getting to, but Masonry in particular, because it's a living, existing, tangible group, here we are, is the subject of a tremendous amount of vitriol and hatred and suspicion. Almost all of it within the circuit think of conspiracy thought that requires almost no evidence other than supposition. Supposition is sufficient enough. Connections are sufficient enough in the mind of whomever is throwing stones. And in this country, a vast anti-Masonic movement arose in what was called the Burned Over District, this magnificently fertile, including religiously fertile, area of central New York State. We have here a denizen of the Burned Over District, Amelia Sheldon. You're our ambassador of the Burned Over District. And the Burned Over District, which is a snaking stretch of land bordered by the city of Albany in the east and Buffalo in the west, was, for the first two generations of the 19th century, ground zero for everything that was innovative and inventive in religion, not only in American life, but I would say in Western life in general. It was the birthplace of spiritualism. It was the birthplace of suffragism. It was the birthplace of Mormonism. It was the birthplace of Seventh-day Adventism. It was the birthplace of some of America's earliest experiments in utopianism or biblical communism, communal living. It produced so much. It also produced, in 1826, a wave of anti-Masonry. And the events are so fantastic and yet so dead to right factual that I am always moved to say that reality is infinitely more fascinating than anything conspiratorial ideas can come up with. And this is the actual reality. A disgruntled Mason living in the town of Batavia, William Morgan, was not being given the lodge credentials that he felt were owed to him. And he felt very dejected and angry, and he decided that he was going to write a tell-all book about Freemasonry. He was going to spill the Masonic secrets and rites and rituals to the public. The print shop where the plates of his book were housed was burned down in a suspicious fire, and Morgan himself later disappeared and was rumored to be murdered. Months later, a body washed up ashore one of the area lakes that was believed to be Morgan, but nobody is altogether sure what happened to him. But there was at that time a widespread belief that he was kidnapped by Masonic zealots and drowned or killed or made to vanish. His widow, Lucinda, soon married a man who was involved in the nascent Mormon faith. The Book of Mormon was published by a young Joseph Smith, not far outside of Batavia, New York, where these events transpired. And Lucinda and her new husband moved west with Smith and the Mormon movement. She later became one of Joseph Smith's many spiritual wives, and Smith himself was fascinated with Smith himself was fascinated with Freemasonry and believed that many of the rites and rituals in Freemasonry were recreations of some of the rites of the ancient Hebrew priests. And that notion figures in a very central way into Mormonism. And the two movements, although they're very different in nature, they grew together in terms of ritual, practice, liturgy, passion plays, things of that nature. Now, the public at the time, this was the age of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was elected president, and you'll love this. The whole idea was Andrew Jackson was supposed to clean up corruption in high places, and people were concerned that there was an excess of Masonic influence in police departments and the courts and the justice system. So we're going to elect Jackson, and he's going to go in there and clean this up. Well, Andrew Jackson was a Freemason, but this is our American habit, you know. We find the very person who we're angry at, and then we elect him to clean up this whole mess. We're going to fix this. So there grew from the burned over district an animosity towards Freemasonry that eventually mushroomed into anti-Freemasonic political parties, anti-Freemasonic newspapers, anti-Masonic lecture societies, and it spread all over the country. Now, within about 20 years, things settled down, things died down. And look, you know, people were right. They were right to be concerned over corruption in the courts, corruption in police forces, corruption and favorable dealings being done within the justice system. All those things were healthy things to be concerned about. But again and again and again, as with the Templars, there is this projection of a problem onto this identifiable group, which, like any group, is going to have within it the various human foibles that we all carry with us, like a turtle carries its shell wherever we go. But there is this tendency to over-dramatize, inflate, and exploit people's fears, channeling and directing them toward a certain group. Masonry, after that episode, never fully reassumed the very central role that it had in American life. It was still, and remains so, an influential organization and an important organization. But the salad days of Masonry as a place where some of the cream of learned society would pass through. Washington's generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence, framers of the Constitution. You know, those days had passed, and yet I feel in my heart, and this is really the point of tonight's exchange, I feel in my heart that there's a renewed destiny hanging over Freemasonry. And I say that with absolute plainness of intent. I would never exaggerate or resort to some dramatic language if I didn't feel that it was veritably true. I do believe that we're witnessing something happening within Masonry that's not based around numbers, but that's based around ideals that's very important to us at this moment in history. And I want to back up a bit before returning to that point. It seems to me that there have been junctures in history where Masonry, an organization whose origins we can only speculate about. Masonry is one of the few organizations in modern life that has produced its own outstanding coterie of historical scholars, some of whose names I'm going to mention. And yet, its origins remain a source of hypothesizing, theorizing. We don't really have an absolute dead-to-rights, consensus-based point of view on where Masonry came from. But one of the extraordinary things about Masonry as an organization is people within the organization are perfectly capable of holding their own perspective and point of view as to its origin, and there are no faction splits over it. Nobody takes their ball and goes home. Well, there's always one or two people who take their ball and go home. But it's not a point, it's not a breaking point. It's not a point of fissure. It's not a problem within the organization, and never has been that there are differences as to its origins. Some people might say that the organization goes back to the builders of Solomon's Temple. Some might say, I think with very good reason, that it goes back to the early cathedral building of the early Middle Ages. The Notre Dame Cathedral began to get built around 1136. And let me tell you, the building of cathedrals in France and then later in other parts of Europe did an enormous amount to lift the European economy over what we used to call the Dark Ages, this period of plague and dissolution of order and people living these very hard scrabble subsistence existences on feudal estates, and there being different local chieftains who are in charge of everything. That's what happens when there is no economy. Everybody is just living on the scraps of whatever they can produce. But with the advent of cathedral building in Europe, what could be called and should be called operative masonry, suddenly an economy starts developing. Suddenly, people are trafficking in precious stones and craftsmanship and the building trades, and there's an apprentice system, and people are getting educated. So there's this moment where Europe has existed for years and years with pestilence, warfare, disease, banditry, plague, a great deal of misery, a very short life expectancy. And with the advent of an ecclesiastical, spiritual, meaning-based form of architecture, we're not just building barns here, but we're building structures that are supposed to send the individual to a transcendent place. And anybody can visit these things. Anybody who's grazing sheep can walk 10 miles and enter the cathedral on a given day. the development of these meaning-based structures, which are reproduced, albeit in a smaller scale, in some of the very things that we see around us, gave the Western world an economy when previously there really had just been a very grim, gruesome subsistence form of living for several centuries. I think it's very, very legitimate to trace the earliest forms of Freemasonry to that operative Masonry, because the builders themselves, I mean, sure, I mean, they're using the trowel, they're using the square and compass, they're using the apron, they're using the things that are products of the building trade, but they're building edifices that are, I would say without question, probably the most ambitious building projects since probably the dawn of the pyramids in terms of sheer size and sheer majesty. Of course, you'd find magnificent building projects in Persia, in the Hellenic nations, Rome, Greece, some truly magnificent, but the scale and the spread and the enlistment of the whole society, in a sense, into the economy and artistry of these structures, it was a turning point. It was a turning point for the human story in the Western world, at least. And I do believe that you can see the nascence of Freemasonry at that point. And it seems to me that Masonry has a way of kind of bobbing and weaving, undulating under and then above ground at times of crisis. Now, you'll have to forgive me because I'm going to speak in some real historic leaps. I mean, it's of necessity given the need to economize our time tonight. Within about 150 years of the building of the cathedrals, you start to see in the Western world a fanning out of culture and a definition of culture that gets broader and broader. And this is what we would call the Renaissance, or French for rebirth. Ideas begin to get rediscovered from humanity's ancient past, humanity's pre-Abrahamic past. The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, at that point really blanketed the Western world. The East had its traditions of Vedism, Confucianism, animism, Shinto, Buddhism, Hinduism, so forth. But in terms of the Western world, Christianity, Islam, and to a lesser extent Judaism were pretty much blanketing the population of the world. And yet during the Renaissance, an incredible thing starts to happen, which is the fitful, gradual rediscovery of surviving writings from our pre-Abrahamic past. Writings that were produced in North Africa, in Persia, in the Mediterranean, in the Greek and Roman empires, and of course, above all, the Egyptian Empire. And writings that are later referred to as Hermeticism begin to spread throughout the Renaissance. These were works that were written on cloth or papyrus scrolls that are attributed to the Greco-Egyptian man god of Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. This was a term of honor that Greek scribes in the city of Alexandria gave to Egypt's god of writing, Thoth, who they saw not only as the progenitor of their own Hermes, later Mercury, but as 3 times as great as Hermes. And in the royal courts of Florence in the 1460s, these Hermetic manuscripts, which are written in Greek by Greco-Egyptians, by Philo-Egyptians, by descendants of Ptolemy, descendants of Cleopatra, people who came in as a conquering army, but who culturally, in a certain sense, were conquered themselves by Egyptian culture. And Greek scribes began to write down ancient Egyptian ideas in an expository language that we modern Westerners can get our arms around, can understand. Just a little side note I want to mention. These Hermetic manuscripts, which were referred to as the Corpus Hermeticum and came to number about 17 pamphlet-sized works that were originally written in Greek and then got translated into Latin. They are the closest timeline that we have to the thought of ancient Egypt written in an expository language. We have other treasures from ancient Egypt, more often in the form of symbol, building, tracts that give us ideas of rituals. Of course, hieroglyphs as well. We in the West were unable to even decode hieroglyphs until about 1799, 1800. Can you imagine? It's really not that long ago. Now, these Hermetic manuscripts that I'm talking about, in which Egyptian ideas were codified into Greek, translated into Latin, the originals are lost. The originals are lost. And it's such a tragedy. If you want to write a thriller like Dan Brown, make it about somebody finding the original Hermetic manuscripts. And this just goes to show how still impoverished we really are to understanding our own ancient past. We couldn't understand hieroglyphs, we in the West, until about 1800. Napoleon was kind enough to invade Egypt and found the Rosetta Stone, and because that was a tripartite linguistic document, we were able to finally read hieroglyphs. And we don't even have the originals of these Hermetic manuscripts, which in a certain sense ignited the intellectual search of the Renaissance. We're so impoverished with regard to our past. That's why I always feel like we have to tread very carefully when we're saying, like, well, you know, Rosslyn Chapel was built by the Knights Templar, and, you know, Solomon's builders did this. I mean, we have no idea. These are some of the most important pillars of our understanding of our own ancient past, and we don't even have the damn originals. They got burned, they got lost, they got sold at a garage sale. You know, none of us have any idea. But with the Renaissance in motion, there was finally a recovery of amnesia in the Western world. There was finally a recovery of amnesia that human history didn't, the human search for meaning didn't just begin with the Old Testament and then progress to the New Testament and then the Quran, and, you know, that's all she wrote. No, that there was this vast stretch of millennia in which humanity was invested in polytheism, was invested in a spiritual search that saw the individual as intimately connected to the cosmos. You know, one of the retentions that we have of this way of thought is astrology, is Western astrology. Western astrology began in ancient Mesopotamia, where we have the first writings that connect human character, human events, the human situation to different constellations, and the thread has gotten broken, and yet you would recognize some of the astrological symbols and ideas from ancient Mesopotamia. Mars being a god of conflict, Aries being a symbol of spring and birth and renewal. Venus, it wouldn't have been, the name wouldn't have been such at that point, being a symbol of beauty and sexuality. These symbols are things that although they have changed terms, the thread has been broken, there have been rearrangements, there's a basic astrological language that has survived. It's incredible, to me at least, that modern people almost everywhere in the world, east, west, where there are different astrological systems, but nonetheless, within the framework of those systems, every modern person, and I'm certain everyone in this room, could name his or her sun sign, what constellation the sun was in at the time of your first breath, and tell you something about its traits. It does connect us, however distantly, to some of our most ancient ancestors, and it's extraordinary. And so within the Renaissance, even though this flowering of ideas played out only among people who had a command over language, had access to books and scrolls, probably were part of the church structure, probably were part of the royal structure. Regardless, it did give birth to this idea, which could never again be suppressed, that humanity has this vast tradition of search that is immeasurably older than our standard Abrahamic monotheism, that we belong to something else. We belong to something else. There was, as there always invariably is, a backlash against this religious experimentation as the Renaissance wore on. And backlashes not infrequently occur through influential people dying or getting deposed. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth of England died. That was very bad for those of us who care about the spiritual search. Queen Elizabeth was not a radical figure, but she was a relatively liberal figure, and there was a kind of cult around Queen Elizabeth, and I use the word cult in its gentlest iteration. There was a cult of intellectuals and artists and magicians around Queen Elizabeth, and they used to call her Diva Elisabetta, Diva Elisabetta. A diva is not supposed to be somebody who behaves badly at nightclubs and, throws champagne around. A diva, it means divine, divine Elisabetta, divine Elizabeth. She was a patron of artists, spiritual seekers, magicians, occultists, including the legendary John Dee, who died about 6 years after Elizabeth's passing. When Elizabeth died, England was taken over by King James I, for whom the King James Bible is named. And he was not very good-humored towards the occult experimentation of the Renaissance. He wanted nothing to do with it. He wanted a retrenchment. He wanted England out of the business of religious freedom and religious experimentation. The similar things were playing out across the European continent. There was a royal family, the Habsburg Empire, I'm sure many of you have heard of them, that was religiously conservative. The Habsburgs were very closely aligned to the Vatican, not exclusively, but closely. And the Habsburgs gave birth to a rebel son, Rudolph II. And Rudolph decided to move the seat of the Habsburg Empire in the early 1600s, coinciding with Elizabeth's death, from Vienna to the city of Prague. And he specifically relocated the seat of the Habsburg Empire to Prague because he was a student of the occult sciences. He was interested in alchemy, astrology, number symbolism, spell work, all kinds of different occult and esoteric and ancient philosophies. And he created a kind of ingathering in Prague and Bohemia of artists and occultists and esotericists. And he issued a document in 1609 called the Letter of Majesty. And in the Letter of Majesty, he more or less extended religious freedom to various residents of the Prague, Bohemia territory. And as a result of the Letter of Majesty and other upcroppings from the late Renaissance, the area of Central Europe that's bordered by the Rhine Valley in the west and Prague and Bohemia in the east, a German-speaking area, became, for a time, almost the equivalent of what I was describing about the burned-over district a little before. They didn't have Doug's fish fry, but it was an area of tremendous religious experimentation. And as such, all these different works and ideas that were influenced by Hermeticism, influenced by the rediscovery of our ancient spiritual past, were trafficking throughout Central Europe. And Rudolf II was very promoting of this. But he died in 1612, and he was replaced by his brother Matthias. Now, Matthias was a much more conservative figure, but Matthias was also known as a very conciliatory, somewhat laid-back guy. And for about 5 years, Matthias didn't do really much of anything. He was a conservative Catholic, but he seemed to have more or less a live and let live attitude. And the Habsburg family was getting very pissed off over all this. And so after Matthias's death, or a couple of years before his death, he had grown frail. In 1617, they brought in a new monarch, Ferdinand II, and he was going to crack down on things. And Ferdinand immediately rescinded the Letter of Majesty, and Protestants in Bohemia, Prague, Central Europe were extremely unhappy because they had tasted religious freedom for about 5-6 years, and this freedom, this absence of harassment was grasped away from them. And there was kind of a summit meeting between some of Ferdinand's advisors and some Protestant rebels who were very unhappy with these events. And the meeting got heated, and the Protestant rebels took 3 of Ferdinand's advisors, and they threw them out of a second-story window from this house where they were meeting. This is known as the Defenestration of Prague. The men lived. It wasn't really that, I mean, you know, maybe today throwing somebody out a window would be a big deal, but it was a more brutal era, and throwing somebody out a window was perhaps not the worst thing that could ever happen to you. I mean, they weren't imprisoned in a dungeon or something, or executed. But it did spark outbreaks of violence. And the Protestant rebels were so upset with Ferdinand II that they made an appeal to a more liberal wing of the Habsburgs, Frederick and Elizabeth Stuart. Elizabeth Stuart was a daughter of King James I, and Frederick was a well-educated, artistically inclined, experimentally minded, liberal member of the Habsburgs. The rebels, the Protestant rebels, implored Frederick and Elizabeth to come in to Prague to get rid of Ferdinand and to take control themselves. Long story short, that's what they did. There were political maneuverings. The Habsburgs were sort of like an exclusive club, where if you could gather enough votes, you could get rid of your political adversaries. And that's what they did, and they deposed Frederick. And so by this point, the Habsburgs had had enough, and they decided they were going to make war on members of their own family, Frederick and Elizabeth in this case. And the Protestants felt very secure because they thought, well, Elizabeth is the daughter of King James, and he will certainly send military assistance to her side. He's not going to let his daughter get routed and run off the throne. Well, James was going to do just exactly that. He didn't care. He was disdainful of religious freedom. He was disgusted with the progress of occultism, esoterica, religious experimentation during the Renaissance. He had no intention of saving his daughter. And within about 1 year, Habsburg armies amassed outside of Prague. This was in 1620. It's called the Battle of White Mountain, and they wiped out Elizabeth and Frederick's forces and sent them fleeing. There was so much warfare going on at that time. skirmishes had been breaking out across Central Europe, pitting basically Catholic Habsburg armies against rebel Protestant armies. And this turned into what was later called the 30 Years' War, and it lasted from 1618 until 1648. And it was devastating. It absolutely decimated that German-speaking area of Central Europe. And the devastation lasted for generations after, because demobilized soldiers became bandits and brigands and pirates. Towns and villages and cities had been destroyed. Livestock and agriculture had been destroyed. It just completely wiped out this experimental, relatively liberal, German-speaking part of Central Europe. And this is where the Masonic narrative starts to reemerge. You start to see hints in literature of people being inducted into Masonic lodges. There's a Scottish poem written in 1638 called Mirthful Mornings, or The Muses' Threnody, The Muses' Threnody. It's a long epic poem singing an elegy to a local Scotsman who was beloved. And there's a line from this poem which I want to quote to you exactly. And when you hear it, you won't forget it. These are 3 lines that occur in this epic poem. This is history. For we be brethren of the rosy cross. We have the Mason word and second sight. Things for to come, we can foretell aright. We be brethren of the rosy cross. We have the Mason word and second sight. Now, in the original manuscript, Mason word is underlined. It's emphasized. It's meaningful. Now, concurrent with the destruction of religious freedom, or relative religious freedom, in this part of Central Europe, a movement starts to arise called the Rosicrucians. In 1614, in an area that we today would consider modern Germany, a manuscript written in German appears called the Fama Fraternitatis, the Fama Fraternitatis, the fame of our fraternity, our famous fraternity. And the Fama Fraternitatis alleges to be a manifesto heralding the existence of a secret society that believes in the basic equality of all individuals, that believes in radical ecumenism. In other words, you're free to practice whatever faith you wish, that believes in a social polity, in creating hospitals and colleges and programs to aid the poor and programs of universal education. And this blows people's minds. You know, nobody knows who this secret organization is. Who are these people? And people want to join it, but they don't know where to petition. They don't know what to do. And then, in the next year, 1614, another manuscript appears in central Germany, this one written in Latin, called the Confessio Fraternitatis, the Confessions of Our Fraternity. And this manuscript tells a story that this secret brotherhood, this secret fraternity, was born in the Middle East, and that there was a great pilgrim named Christian Rosenkreuz. And Christian Rosenkreuz lived to be 106 years old, and he traveled through the nations of Persia and the Middle East and North Africa, learning ancient religious secrets, and that he encrypted these secrets into a vault, into a chamber in which he was buried. Almost like you see this vault door over here in a certain sense. And Christian Rosenkreuz was entombed in this vault, and he left instructions for some of his brothers to find the vault at a time when it was needed. And so some of the brothers found the vault, and according to the manuscript, they opened it up, and there was this blinding light that came from it. Even though there was no source of light anywhere to be detected within the vault, it was the light of the inner search. It was an alchemical light of the inner search. And they entered the vault, or the tomb, of Christian Rosenkreuz, and they found all these esoteric symbols and ideas that took shape in the form of these manuscripts that I'm referencing. And the following year, there was the third and final manuscript. This one also returned to being written in German, called The Chemical Romance of Christian Rosenkreuz. The Chemical Romance of Christian Rosenkreuz. And it was an allegorical story of a young pilgrim being called to a palace to assist in a royal wedding. But the royal wedding was a joining of the masculine and feminine form. Yes, of course, it was a king and a queen, but these were metaphors. These were metaphors for the alchemical joining of male and female. And the idea being that this was the divine hermaphrodite. This was an extra human being that had all the traits of masculinity and femininity. And the idea was that the perfected being wouldn't be defined by any particular term or idea or affiliation. And these manuscripts were the source of tremendous controversy and interest. Again, educated people everywhere, they wanted to join. Who is this hidden brotherhood? They didn't know where to find it. There were symbols and there were hints in it. They used symbols from the work of John Dee. Some people thought maybe this group is a group of disgruntled followers of John Dee, who was deposed and died in exile in poverty after the death of his patron, Queen Elizabeth. Others thought, oh, maybe it's a group of radical Lutherans. There was a grouping called Pietists. They were radical, mystical Lutherans who were being oppressed, newly oppressed in Bohemia. And others, of course, believed that, no, this is an actual brotherhood. This is an actual hidden fraternity. But nobody could find any lodges or minutes or membership rolls or anything of that nature. And yet, you start to see the onward march of subtle references to Freemasonry. In 1646, a British antiquarian named Elias Ashmole, who was an occultist and an esotericist, he recorded in his journals, specifically and explicitly, being inducted along with several friends into a Freemasonic lodge. And this is very, very valuable because stuff gets destroyed. You know, as I was saying, the early Hermetic manuscripts, we've lost them. They get destroyed. So to have a piece of handwritten evidence of somebody saying in 1646 that he was inducted with some friends who he names into a Freemasonic lodge is extremely valuable. Right around the same time, just a couple of years before, there's another Englishman named Robert Moray, who also leaves in his papers and in his manuscripts specific recollection of being inducted into a Freemasonic lodge. And believe it or not, lodge minutes still exist where Moray signed his name onto a meeting ledger with the symbol of a pentagram. And Moray was very important. He later became one of the founders of the Royal Society, which was the Enlightenment Society of Arts and Culture, still exists to this day. And so you begin to pick up these very, very definite references that people are making to Freemasonry, to Rosicrucianism, and in the papers of Elias Ashmole, you find documents in which he writes out a petition to join the Rosicrucians. He doesn't know where to send it, but he also makes the effort of writing by hand copying by hand the first two of the Rosicrucian manuscripts. And it isn't until more than a generation later, in 1717, that the Grand Lodge of England, the Freemasonic Grand Lodge of England, emerges above ground for the first time. You have all these underground references. You have these literary references. You have just a few memoranda of lodge meetings and minutes, notes of induction. And then the Grand Lodge emerges above ground for the first time in 1717. And there is almost an immediate backlash. The Vatican issues a papal bull against Freemasonry, and a papal bull, as some of you may be aware, is the highest level of church legal document that can be issued. It's issued directly from the pen of the Pope, and it's considered infallible. In that sense, it's elevated to the same level as Scripture. And you might ask yourself, why would it be so important, of all the things that are going on across the world at every moment of life, for the papacy to issue a papal bull, an irrevocable, infallible document condemning Freemasonry? In the next century, another such document was issued. This one was an encyclical saying that no Catholics could be members of Freemasonry. Now, there are many Catholics who are members of Freemasonry, and I know this for a fact because I've had in-laws who are Catholics and are members of Freemasonry. So it didn't seem to have a great deal of teeth. But Cardinal Ratzinger, in 1983, before he became Pope Benedict, he issued a document, a legal document of his own, reasserting the primacy of these legal rulings. And even our own Pope Francis, who is generally pretty temperate, in an interview in 2013, told a group of reporters on his airplane, and you can look up the reference, he said, "My biggest problem is Masonic lobbies." I'm thinking, well, maybe your biggest problem is world hunger, but his biggest problem is Masonic lobbies. And so this strain of anti-Masonry has persisted throughout the church, but I would say not so much among the rank and file, not so much among the laity, as among the church hierarchy. And I think there are many different reasons for this, but one of the reasons that has helped entrench this hostility to Freemasonry is the existence of a renegade Masonic group, not a free and accepted group, but a renegade Masonic group, which you've all heard of, called the Illuminati, the all-purpose bad guy for everything. And anytime I go on late night radio and say anything nice about the Illuminati, I get all this hate mail. You know, I talk about all kinds of controversial subjects, from Satanism to ESP, and everybody's like, fine, I mentioned the Illuminati, everybody's pissed off. And I made the mistake one time of speaking to a certain, on a certain streaming television channel, and the host said to me, "What do you think about the Illuminati?" And I said, "I love the Illuminati," and I got hate mail like you would not believe. I still haven't recovered from it. But let me tell you briefly the story of the Illuminati and why they're significant to our gathering tonight. The Illuminati were formed on May 1st, 1776 in Bavaria by a lawyer and philosopher named Adam Weishaupt. Now let me say the following. For a secret society, the Illuminati did a wonderful job of minute and record keeping. We have rosters of members and meeting places, and this is why the Bavarian aristocracy was able to crack down on them. Nobody hadn't, apparently told them, fellas, don't write this stuff down. They wrote everything down. They were very fine record keepers. Good for history, not so good for surviving if the aristocracy wants your head. The fact is, even with the founding, the above-ground establishment of Freemasonry, and even with some measures towards religious freedom that had been effected in the old world, there was slow progress. And Weishaupt and his colleagues, who included the philosopher Goethe, and may have included the composer Mozart, who belonged to some lodges, Freemasonic lodges, that were considered shot through with Illuminati members. Weishaupt and his colleagues were very unhappy with what they felt was the really slow, plodding nature of progress in the direction of religious freedom, separation of church and state, separation of privilege from bloodline, and removing aristocratic and Vatican influences from the judicial system. Things that we would consider basic good civics that could cost you your head in Bavaria in 1776. And so Weishaupt and his colleagues came up with a plan to form a more radical, renegade variant of Freemasonry. And the idea was they were going to infiltrate Freemasonic lodges, and while participating fully in rank and file Masonic activities, we're also going to be working sort of Leninist style to reorient these lodges in a more political direction. They were explicitly interested in putting their members into positions of power and influence where, as they saw it, they could pursue liberal, classically liberal political ideas. Again, ecumenism, separation of church and state, the kinds of stuff that Thomas Jefferson and Franklin and others were calling for in the New World, to which we're going to get in just a moment. And so the progress that they made among artists and intellectuals was considerable, but they attracted the immediate ire, anger, suspicion, and eventually oppression of the aristocratic regime. A series of 4 laws got passed very soon after the founding of the Illuminati. The first law banned all societies that were not approved by the aristocracy. The second law specifically outlawed the Illuminati. The third law authorized seizure of property and banishment for members of the Illuminati. And the fifth and final law sentenced members of the Illuminati to death. Now, we don't have any records of anybody actually being put to death under that law, but there were a good many banishings in which people's property, homes were seized, and they were either imprisoned or they were forced out of Bavaria. I have to say this very plainly and very clearly. After this final law of 1790, there is no record whatsoever of the existence of an organization called the Illuminati. There is nothing but conspiratorial supposition about the Illuminati fomenting the French Revolution, fomenting the Russian Revolution, fomenting the American Revolution, denying you your health benefits today. Blame that on Etna. Don't blame the Illuminati, which were basically a group of occult-themed classical liberals who hoped to use a renegade form of Freemasonry to infuse liberal principles into a very slow-moving society. It's super, super easy when we use these terms to forget the human beings that were caught up in this pathos. And I want to read briefly from a letter that an imprisoned member of the Illuminati sent to the founder, Adam Weishaupt. This was a man named Ferdinand von Megenhofen. He wrote this letter on November 29th, 1785. He had his property, his title, his family stripped from him, and he had been imprisoned in a monastery for his activities. He wrote the following to Weishaupt. I'm just quoting a small passage of it. "My teacher, my friend, here am I sitting in this lonely cell, my dear friend, to which superstition and fanaticism have condemned me. And my first thought is for you. Could you, my teacher, ever have supposed a few years ago, when we were rejoicing among ourselves at the progress made in our institute and at the tremendous advances which our country was making in enlightenment and culture, could you ever have believed that the reward for our labors would be for you banishment to a foreign country with your wife and children, and for me imprisonment in a monastery by way of punishment, because we attempted to enlighten our fellow countrymen and to dam the strongly flowing stream of spiritual despotism. Now, von Megenhofen was released about 5 years later, and shortly after he was released, he drowned. The boat that he was in on a lake overturned, he drowned, his body was not found for a while. A priest was kind enough to tell his family, well, because he was a member of the Illuminati, his body immediately immaterialized and went to hell. Later, great comfort. Later, they found von Megenhofen's immaterialized body, which had washed ashore. But I read that brief passage just because it's important to remember not only the human pathos of the situation, but of course, today, everybody's on social media blathering, mostly anonymously, about this position or that position, and nobody has any skin in the game. Nobody has any skin in the game. Here were people who really did sacrifice their lives and their safety and their well-being for the things that they believed in. And so when I say I love the Illuminati, I'm comfortable standing on those words. Letter writers, angry emailers be damned. As all of this was playing out in Europe, of course, you heard mention of the year 1776. May 1776 marked the founding of the Illuminati. July 4th, 1776 marked the founding of the Continental Congress and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And as it happens, there were many founders in the United States, in the American colonies, what were still the American colonies, who were Freemasons. This included George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, Paul Revere, an outsized number of Washington's generals, an outsized number of the signers of the Declaration, an outsized number of the framers of the Constitution. And there were other extraordinary groupings of Freemasons, one of which I want to mention tonight, and that is Prince Hall Masonry, the Black American Masonic tradition. Prince Hall was a freed man of color, a leather worker who lived in the city of Boston. And he and about 30 black colleagues got together and they wanted to form their own Freemasonic lodge. At that time, Freemasonry, like most institutions, was segregated. Organizations, however liberal or radical they profess to be, almost always reflect the local or the national prejudices of their place of origin. And I can't say that Freemasonry, at least as far as the United States was concerned, was at that time any different. However, they were given, and the story gets very convoluted and complicated, but there was a British Army officer, of all people, who gave them a Freemasonic charter. And Prince Hall Masonry was founded in the year 1777. Now, the year to me is very significant because for a long, long time, Prince Hall Masonry was said to be founded in 1775. And this is one of the interesting wrinkles of writing history. Why, for years and years and years, actually until 2016, did we believe that Prince Hall Masonry was founded in 1775? Well, somebody at the Massachusetts Historical Society made a mistake. And in 1795, they wrote down the wrong year. They wrote down the wrong year. Now, of course, historians look at this. Well, this is an august source, right? 1795, Massachusetts Historical Society. They must have remembered correctly, right? Well, wrong. There are two Masonic historians. They might have friends in this room. Oscar Allende and John Hairston Bay. Oscar and John are brilliant historians who in 2016 wrote a monograph called Landmarks of Our Fathers. And they proved dead to rights that Prince Hall was founded 2 years later than we think it was. You wouldn't think we'd get the date of the Revolutionary War wrong. You wouldn't think that we'd get, just some epochal piece of history wrong, but it does happen. It does happen, which is why sources need to be checked and rechecked. And these two Masonic scholars, themselves Freemasons, did the yeoman's work of checking the sources and realized that Prince Hall Masonry started in 1777. Now, dig this. Prince Hall, who was the Grand Master of the Lodge, which was at that time called African Lodge No. 1. It was only later that it was renamed in his honor, Prince Hall Masonry. He affixed his signature to two petitions against slavery in the American colonies. One of them in 1776 and another in 1778. And at that time, in the American colonies, the movement that later was called abolitionism hadn't really fully formed into being. Now, I want to say this very, very carefully. The first black-led abolitionist movement in the American colonies was Freemasonic in nature. That is a historical fact. Now, I'm not saying that abolition itself strictly came from Freemasonry. There were different sources. There was the Enlightenment thought of figures like John Locke, who, by the way, didn't think that Catholics or atheists should be allowed to vote. But, we all have our bad days. And there was the Enlightenment thought of figures like Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau. And then there was the moral imperative that grew out of religions like Quakerism. But it's very, very important to recognize that the first black-led abolitionist movement in this nation was Freemasonic in nature. Why don't kids learn this stuff? Somebody might actually want to go to history class for a change. And I think that this is important because the sense that there exists a basic equality of the human condition in America. Yes, of course, we fail at it, we get it wrong, there are many switchbacks. It must be understood that this had to grow out of an experience. Farmers were not sitting around at night by candlelight or gas lamp reading Rousseau or Locke or even Thomas Paine. There was something about the hands-on embodiment of these values within Masonry as a living organization that I think helped interject them into the blood flow and the groundwater of the nation. It is a very meaningful thing that figures like Washington and Franklin, for example, were lifelong Freemasons, and many whose names, of course, we don't remember, because at that time, this nation was such a rural place. It was a very agricultural place, and it remained so up until the 20th century. The primary institutions were church, maybe a public house somewhere, maybe a Grange Hall, your farm, or your trade, or whatever your business was. There were very few hospitals, there were very few universities, there were no libraries at that time. So the ideals that you imbibed really came through whatever grouping or community or congregation that you belonged to. And to declare yourself a member of an esoteric society in so rural a nation, so agricultural a nation, where there weren't all the institutions that we know today. There was no such thing as academia. There were no teaching hospitals. Yeah, sure, there were churches. There was a tiny little cathedral that we have over on Elizabeth Street downtown, but there wasn't much beyond farm life, family, and congregation. And for somebody to take the step of joining an organization that used occult and esoteric symbolism as a code for ethical development, and to join an organization that required equal treatment of all the members within the group, democratic election of officers within the group, ecumenism and the honoring of different faiths. This was a tremendously radical step when you think about the letter that I just read from von Megenhofen from Bavaria, who was stripped of his entire existence for endorsing those very things, stripped of his entire existence. And I've mentioned to you some of the undulating fortunes of Masonry in this country, the advent of an anti-Masonic movement. Obviously, every mutual aid society, every organization in American life today, other than Twitter, seems to have a crisis of membership. That's true across this whole nation. We're no longer a nation of joiners. When I was a little kid, my father belonged to the Knights of Pythias, an organization that at one time had a million members, that today worldwide has maybe between 40 and 50,000 members, maybe. My father never went to the meetings. The newsletters would always come to the house, and I said to him, you know, Dad, why are you a member of the Knights of Pythias if you never attend the meetings? And he said, so I have some place to be buried, because they have burial benefits. And yet these things are very, very important in American life. But the 4-H club, the JCs, the Rotary, the Lions, Masonry, Knights of Columbus, Knights of Pythias, you name it, mutual aid societies have fallen in hard times. And this is not new news. This has been true for at least a generation. And yet, I said earlier that I feel that there's a destiny hanging over Freemasonry today. And I feel that with all my heart for the following reason. There are, and I think we all know this, there are influences felt in our society, in every society, that can't be directly correlated with membership numbers, that have to be correlated with fineness of ideas. And one of the reasons why it's always moving and meaningful for me to speak at Masonic lodges is that Masonry, right now, in the 21st century, presents a form of communication, a form of civics, a form of search that is the closest thing that I can find anywhere across the modern landscape that is an opposing polarity to the hate, the sarcasm, the cynicism, the rhetorical questions, the sneering language that populates social media. And I think that a very, very small number of us can, I believe, I have no hope for humanity as a collective whole. Why would there be hope for humanity as a collective whole? But it seems to me there have always been pockets of individuals, whatever you call them Rosicrucians, call them Illuminati, call them Freemasons, whatever term or word is pertinent to a certain era. But there's a certain number of people who believe in enshrining and protecting the individual search for meaning without the vituperative, bellicose, hateful, shorthanded language that has fanned out from social media, so much of it anonymous, which I find the pinnacle of cowardice, so much of it anonymous. And it has infected our entire political culture. There was perhaps never a good old days in American politics. That would be nostalgia. But I certainly remember as a kid, as I'm sure some of you in this room remember, there wasn't this bellicosity, there wasn't this suspicion, there wasn't this absolutist paranoia, there wasn't this either-or thinking that infected every discussion, every gathering, every civic act. And it seems to me that Masonry and some of its earliest, most nascent forms, some of its later forms and offshoots or parallel movements like Illuminism and Rosicrucianism, it seems to me that Masonry has always reasserted its principles, its ideals of ecumenism, of freedom of search, of essential equality of all people, of a non-doctrinaire, non-dogmatic way of viewing the world, of taking seriously the ethical injunctive of reciprocity, of treating another person as an equal in terms of their civics, in terms of their humanity. Masonry has always reasserted this at times of extreme need. And I've noticed, I'm not a Mason myself. I'm a friend of Masonry. I'm a lover of Masonry. Maybe that helps me to be able to make this statement. But I've had the very great privilege of speaking at Masonic lodges all across the country. New England, here in New York, Deep South, West Coast, Southwest. And I've noticed, as I'm sure some of you have noticed, that there is an upcropping of renewed esoteric study within Freemasonry. Yes, it has social functions. Yes, it has civic functions. Yes, it has charitable functions. And there are lodges where those things are dominant, but there are plenty of lodges where you will find a hallowed honoring of the search and an interest in having programs and evenings like this one. And I have to say this, I haven't seen an exception to it, so I'm just going to say it. All the Masons that I have met at these lodges who are interested in the search, interested in esoteric study, I cannot be plain enough about the solidity and the quality and the neighborliness and the common decency of the individuals that I've encountered. I don't think that's accidental. I think Masonry attracts people who may harbor those traits and then builds those traits within them. And it's not only men. There's a co-Freemasonic tradition, and that's been true actually in this country. Get a load of this. The co-Freemasonic tradition began in Mississippi, the state of Mississippi. There's also a co-Freemasonic tradition in Europe, and there is also the Order of the Eastern Star, which is a women's Masonic organization. I've spoken at a co-Freemasonic lodge in Pasadena, which has a wonderful esoteric convention every couple of years. So I think that Masonry has become an ingathering, at least at the lodges where there's definite interest in esoteric and spiritual study, for people who already have a kind of fine sensitivity about them, and the practices, the symbols, the passion plays, the civic rules that they encounter within Masonry build those traits. The past is always a guide to the present because human nature never changes. And I think one thing that we can count on, one thing that we can stand firm upon is that Masonry, at times of crisis, has been there to reintroduce this golden thread of refinement that the search brings into public life. And I have every confidence as I stand here that Masonry is once again, at this time of crisis in our civic life, reintroducing that golden thread. And maybe that's another meaning that we can ascribe to the G. And I thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's been such a pleasure to exchange with you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.